Hello and welcome to this podcast on the cause of the American Civil War. The first topic is that of cotton and slavery. Slavery had been in the Americas since its introduction by the English to the Jamestown colony in 1619. This would swell massively in pre-revolutionary America, mainly of the necessity of slaves for the purposes of tobacco production. However, slavery was localized and relatively minor as an American industry. Slavery, however, became extremely profitable due to two things. Firstly, the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney made the growing of cotton significantly less labor-intensive and thus cheaper for planters. The second reason was the huge growth in the British and American textile industries, which provided a destination for all this new cheap cotton. In the 70 years between 1790 and 1860, cotton production expanded 500-fold, growing from £2 million to over £1 billion. The cotton boom would push the South from a backwater of the nation to having some of the richest areas and largest ports. This boom promoted the growth in slavery and made slavery the South's main economic livelihood. However, the United States had banned the international slave trade in 1808, which meant that slaves, while freely owned and traded within the United States, could not be imported from Africa. This led to a massive growth in the internal slave trade inside the United States. Slavery, suddenly, due to this boom in their worth, became a huge political issue, mainly on where slavery would allowed to be expanded to. Many in the North opposed slavery on moral and economic grounds, saying it was not moral to own another human being, and that slaves and low-cost labor would put small northern farmers out of jobs. So the reason that the expansion of slavery into new states was so contentious is that while the southern states had always been small in population than the North, and thus had little traction in the House of Representatives, they had almost the same number of states in the Senate, and thus the same amount of votes as the Northern Senate. Therefore, it was vital to both sides to maintain the balance in the Senate, lest either side become too powerful. Now, this need for balance led to most of the compromises, and the first one being the Compromise of 1820, also known as the Missouri Compromise. The territory of Missouri had grown big enough to be a state, and already had a well-established planter class who had brought in slaves into the territory. Thus, Missouri was to be absorbed as a slave state. However, this would upset the balance of power in the Senate, which the North was concerned about. Thus, a deal was struck. Missouri would be taken as a slave state, and Maine would be taken as a free state. This was to maintain the balance of power in the Senate. This, however, was not the important part of the compromise. The most major part was that it said that no new slave states would exist north of Missouri's southern border, the 32nd parallel. Whether this decision also meant that free states could not exist south of the line was never determined. Now, the tenuous state of affairs caused by this compromise was maintained until the Mexican-American War. The war, in which the United States crushed Mexico, led to the second largest acquisition of territory in American history, at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It took in the entirety of the American Southwest, containing Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado. Most of this land was unpopulated desert, and thus of little immediate relevance. However, one particular area was not. This area was that of California. The year after the Mexican-American War ended, California had a massive population boom due to the gold rush of 1849. This meant that California, due to its high population, was ready for immediate statehood. There was one major problem, though. California lay on both sides of the Missouri Compromise line. This meant that once again the integration of a new state was threatening to upset the balance of power in the Senate. Another compromise was made to try and preserve the Union. In 1850, this was the aptly named Compromise of 1850. This compromise had 5 main parts, 2 for either side, and 1 was meant to be for both. The first point was that California would be admitted as a free state, despite its lying both above and below the Missouri Compromise line. The second part was that the border of Texas would be pushed east approximately 250 miles to open up land that, in the Southern imagination, could support 2 or even 3 new slave states. This area would later become Arizona and New Mexico. The third part was aimed at something Northerners had wanted for years, and that was the abolition of the slave trade, not slavery itself, in the District of Columbia. To balance this, the compromise also promised a much stronger, federally funded and enforced Fugitive Slave Act. This act would return escaped slaves who had been hiding in the North back to southern plantations. Unfortunately, this system was rife with corruption, and many free blacks, who had never been slaves, were sold back into slavery. The final part of the compromise, which the drafters hoped would appeal to both sides, was that the Mexican cession, all this land that the United States had acquired, with the exception of California, would have its status on slavery decided by popular sovereignty, essentially a referendum in the territories on whether they would become free states or slave states. The specifics of the process were never outlined, like when in the territorial process it would take place, or how it would be monitored, so as to not alienate any voters voting on the compromise. This made it a largely pointless provision, which became even more pointless later on. This all continued the tenuous balancing act the United States had for decades been trying to make sure that the North and the South neither got to a point where they would consider military action. However, the next major conflict over slavery happened not in the American Southwest, where the compromise was so concerned about, but in Kansas. Kansas was part of the Louisiana Purchase and had been growing for years with influx of new settlers from mainly immigrant backgrounds, and in 1854 applied for statehood. As seen before with new states, Kansas once again threatened to upset the balance of power in the Senate. While the decision on slavery was meant to be decided on popular sovereignty as decided by the U.S. Congress, this just made the entire state turn into chaos. People from both free states and from slave states, from the north and south of Kansas, flooded into the state to try and influence the vote. Massacres, attacks, and other violence was rife in Kansas, leading to its nickname, Bleeding Kansas. In fact, 2 different constitutions were written by 2 different groups for the Constitution of Kansas. One, the Lecompton Constitution, was radically pro-slavery, and the Topeka Constitution, which was radically anti-slavery. Both constitutions were boycotted in their drafting by the other side, meaning that neither constitution was representative of the people of Kansas. However, when the Lecompton Constitution was sent to Washington, it was approved by Democratic President James Buchanan, who was sympathetic to slavery. This was seen as an affront by many people in northern states, as as the Lecompton Constitution did not represent the will of the people of Kansas, as had been promised in the popular sovereignty doctrine, and opened up more land to slavery. There was also another issue that inflamed Northern sentiments. This was the Dred Scott decision. The decision was a decision by the Supreme Court on mainly whether residents in a free state entitled slaves to their freedom. They decided that residents in a free state did not entitle slaves to their freedom, and that, quote, "The Negro has no rights that the white man is bound to respect, and thus that all people of African descent were not citizens of the United States." However, the court also added another provision to the decision. The court said that the spread of slavery into new territories could not be prohibited by anyone at either a federal or state or territorial level, as slaves were property and thus, in the court's opinion, protected under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. This meant that all the careful negotiations that had been set up for years were thrown out the window in one decision. It opened up every state to the expansion of slavery, no matter what decisions any group had made before that. There was an immediate backlash politically. The Whigs, who were the nominally anti-slavery party of the time, tore themselves to pieces trying to figure out what to do about the decision and about Kansas. In the void created by the collapse of the Whig Party, there rose a new party. This was the Republican Party. The Republican Party mainly consisted of former Whigs, Northern Democrats who were against slavery, the remnants of another party called the American Party, or the Nativist Party, or the Know Nothings, who were radically anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic, and another party called the Free Soil Party, which stood for stopping the expansion of slavery. This, while they failed to get elected in 1856, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln became the first Republican president, providing the immediate cause for the Civil War. In the end, while there are other causes of the Civil War, like regionalism and economics, most, if not all, either linked to slavery, and slavery and the questions over it are the main cause of the Civil War. Thanks for listening to this episode of my podcast. I'll have more both on this topic and others next week. Thank you.